بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters and friends, I hope you're all well, inshallah ta'ala. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you've, inshallah, been taking benefit from some of the other webinar sessions. And inshallah, you'll also take something away from this one as well. Obviously, Sapiens Institute is new, and we have a number of things set up in the near future, inshallah, in terms of webinars and essays and workshops and lectures and so on and so forth. So yeah, let's get straight into it, because I do have quite a few slides to get through, and I know that you're probably busy and so on. So yeah, inshallah, let's get on. So obviously the title of this session is Properly Basic Islamic Belief, Ibn Taymiyya and Reformed Epistemology. So it might be the case that for many of you, or at least for some of you, some of these terms that you're going to come across, you may not be familiar with. It may be the first time that you're hearing these terms. And so I'm going to do my best, inshallah, to try and define them for you and to make everything clear. For instance, Properly Basic Belief or Reformed Epistemology on this, the title here, might not be something familiar, but bi'idhnillah, by God's permission, at the end of the session, inshallah, it will be clear. Okay, so let's get into it, inshallah. So we'll just give an outline as to what we intend to cover and get through in this session. So the general thesis or theme of the webinar is going to be looking at something called Reformed Epistemology. Now, in one of the slides, I'm going to go through that in more depth, but just as just to get you familiar with it, Reformed Epistemology is basically the thesis or the idea that religious belief can be rational even without arguments. So that's the general theme of this discussion, and we're going to try and frame this in a unique Islamic way, inshallah. And so Reformed Epistemology in the evidential subjection. So we're going to try to define Reformed Epistemology, understand the thesis, and also understand what it's coming up against. What is it responding to? Why is it a position that philosophers of religion have taken? So yeah, inshallah. And then we're going to look at some concepts such as knowledge and justification and belief to try and help us flesh out this idea that belief in God, or even in Islam, can be something sufficient for knowledge. It can be justified even in the absence of arguments. So in order to build a strong thesis on this point, obviously we need to get familiar with some concepts and terms that will allow us to do that in an academic way. So we're going to look at the idea of knowledge and what sort of conditions that someone might need in order for their beliefs to have it. Also, we're going to look at a particular concept called warrant, and this is linked to the idea of our faculties that aim at giving us beliefs, like our perceptual faculties, hearing, sight, and so on, and reason, and that's a lot to do with them functioning properly as they ought to. This is going to be integral to what we're going to talk about in relation to knowledge. And as I said, we're going to try and develop this in some unique Islamic way, and we're going to be drawing on the ideas of the Damascene 14th century theologian Ibn Taymiyya rahimahullah ta'ala, and we're going to offer a model based on some of his ideas, principally the idea of fitrah, and we're going to look at how this can relate to belief in God as being something that's, let's say, justified without arguments. And then we're going to try and look at extending that model for specifically Islamic belief as well. And then we might discuss some potential problems. What are some of the problems with this thesis or this model that we've offered or are offering? And what are some solutions to those problems? and finally we'll try to take your questions, inshallah. So yeah, bismillah, let's get into the actual session now. So we begin with this idea of an evidentialist objection to theism. So this is an objection to belief in God. Okay, so let me try to paint a picture for you to understand where we're coming from. And we're looking at the idea of burden of proof here. Now, many of you have probably had discussions with atheists or people who don't believe in God, and they'll often suggest that the burden of proof in regards to that belief rests solely on the shoulders of the believer in God. It's up to them to back up their claim, so to speak. They are the ones who need to give us some arguments, you know, in order for us to be warranted. I'm just seeing there is no audio in one of the questions, so I just to double check once again that everybody can hear me, inshallah. You can just verify. So yeah, alhamdulillah. So often atheists will suggest, you know, believers in God, that they have a burden of proof. They need to you know, demonstrate to non-believers why we should believe in God. And they run an argument, maybe not as sophisticated as this one, but you know, your average atheist runs an argument that draws on an intuition a little bit like this. So they'll say something like, belief in God, you know, is justified or warranted. We're going to look at the term warranted in more detail in one of the slides. They'll say, you know, belief in God is justified or warranted only by way of good argument. And then they'll say, but there is no good argument for belief in God, and therefore belief in God is not justified or warranted. So this is the, you know, standard objection to theists who you know, don't offer an argument or don't put some evidence on the table, so to speak. You know, the atheist will lay something down probably similar to this, and this is called the evidentialist objection to theism. There's a traditional way in which people will go about in responding to it, and I'll just mention that in a moment. But we're not going to take that traditional approach, so we're going to take a different approach, inshallah, and that's the novelty of Reformed epistemology as a concept. Remember the idea that religious belief can be rational without arguments. But why think that? Why think that this is the case? Why think that belief in God is justified only by way of good arguments? You know, that sounds plausible maybe at face value, but is it something that we should necessarily accept? I doubt it. Now, it seems to me that there are a number of different beliefs that we hold, and we're very much rational in holding them. We're justified in doing that, and we don't have very good arguments for these beliefs. And in fact, even if we did have good arguments, most of us, if not all of us, don't hold that belief in question on the basis of those arguments, even if they exist. And for the most part, I don't think that they do, at least not in a conclusive sense. So consider belief in the external world. We believe that there is a world out there before us. This world is real in the objective sense. This is not just a figment of our imagination. This is not a dream. And that's a belief that we hold as firm as any other. And yet, you know, philosophers like to speculate. They like to imagine, well, here's my handy animation. So they like to imagine, well, isn't it logically possible that, you know, you are a brain in a jar and there's some alien-like species, you know, putting probes into it, and then it's sort of projecting this dream-like world in the figment of the imagination of this brain, which is ultimately you. And so this is what this world is. This is what this world is. Now, of course, for most of us, you know, this is obvious, as you know, when as long as we're in sound mind, it's pretty clear to us that obviously the world is real out there. This isn't just a dream, and this isn't just a figment of our imagination. But do we dismiss this logical possibility by way of arguments, or do we defend the belief in the external world by way of arguments? Well, it just doesn't seem to me that we do. And could we do so? Well, you see, it seems that any argument that we offer, any reason that's accessible to our own consciousness, that we think about, that we construct, and that we offer, it seems that we're already assuming in some sense that, you know, the world is real as we see it. You know, in order to construct an argument and so on, you have to think, well, yeah, this is something plausible, this is something that I can do because the world is real, my argument relates to something objective, and so on. So it seems to me that, you know, we can't really escape the problem by way of argument, but that's not something to worry about, and it's not a belief that we hold by way of argument. It's a belief we hold intuitively, and yet we all would, you know, defend it, you know, till the cows come home, as we say here in England, you know, without needing arguments. And that's one example, and this belief we would say is rational. What about belief in other minds? That is to say, what about belief in other persons? We believe that there are other persons out there in the world around us. We see plenty of people walking out on the streets, going to school, going shopping, and we see all these different bodies walking amongst us. Do we think that they are just mere sort of robotic machines that don't have conscious mental states like we do? States like, you know, I feel this and I think that, or they think about something, or they reflect. You know, well, we think they obviously have these mental conscious states, just like I do, just like you do. But do I hold that belief by way of argument? Do I argue, you know, from something of, well, you know, they look quite similar to me, they behave and react in a similar way to me, and therefore they probably are similar to me in the sense that they have conscious mental states, therefore they're similar to me in that sense. No, we don't construct arguments like that. It's obvious, you know, when we're born, we don't question the conscious mental states of our mother. It's very obvious that they are a person that's conscious like us. So again, this belief seems to be entirely justified and rational for us, even in the absence of arguments. We believe it intuitively, and it just seems to me that the arguments for it are just not strong anyway. So even if we have arguments, they don't seem to do very much by way of proving it conclusively. So that's the first point. Now, belief in the past. What about belief in the past? Again, some people might say, well, couldn't we have been, you know, created 5 minutes ago with memories that were implanted within us? You know, memories of past events which didn't really occur. You know, isn't that logically possible? But of course, we don't suspect that's the case. We know it's pretty obvious that we weren't created just 5 minutes ago. And could we prove this by way of arguments? Well, it's doubtful that we could prove it by way of a non-circular argument, because when I think about the memories that I have, obviously I'm using the you know, my memory to form the belief about them. And so if I want to demonstrate that I have these memories that really happened, you know, it seems I can't do anything but use and assume the truthfulness of the thing in question, namely, you know, my memory corresponding to real things that happened. So again, it seems we have this belief intuitively, it seems to be rational, justified for us, and yet we don't have arguments for it, or we don't believe this by way of arguments. So what about the reliability of our faculties? Well, what I mean is, you know, we have faculties for cognition, faculties for thought and reason and forming beliefs. We assume in some sense that these faculties are not fallacious. They're not just making constant errors, that they're actually getting us some sort of truth out there in the world. You know, they're aimed at true belief. When I form the belief that there is this laptop screen in front of me, you know, if I thought my faculties were fallacious, then I couldn't trust that belief. But obviously, we don't think like that. And even if I wanted to form my doubt or my skeptical argument, I have to rely on those faculties, and I have to think that or those faculties are capable in some sense of forming an argument that's reliable, plausible, something along those lines. So what about our belief in God then? Remember, the evidentialist, he thinks that belief in God is something that needs to be demonstrated by way of arguments. But we've seen like at least a few beliefs which are perfectly rational, which we can hold justifiably, and yet we don't have arguments necessarily for those, or we don't believe them by way of arguments. So why would our belief in God be so different? Why is it not immune from this same requirement? What's so suspicious or suspect about that belief that it couldn't be held rationally without needing arguments? So here comes Reformed epistemology, and this is the novelty of it. First of all, the novelty is, of course, it rejecting the traditional approach. Well, when I say rejecting, it doesn't reject it. It allows it, but it's not the approach that it takes. What I mean here is that if you remember, our evidentialist objection said that belief in God is justified if and only if, there are good arguments. But there are no good arguments, therefore that belief isn't justified. Now, the traditional theological approach would be to accept the basic principle underlying this argument, but reject it by way of offering arguments. So they would say, well, yeah, okay, premise 1, that's fine, but premise 2, we reject that because there are good arguments for God's existence, and therefore we are justified where you're not. So that's the sort of traditional theological approach, which within Western theological philosophical history is referred to as natural theology, sort of the way, a way of demonstrating God's existence in reference to things in the world rather than in reference to scripture. In the Islamic tradition, we find this very much taken up by the discipline of Ilm al-Kalam. So yeah, but the Reformed epistemologist takes a different approach. The Reformed approach is to reject premise 1. I'm aware of the term epistemology, by the way, not being familiar to some of you so far, but that's okay. Again, the basic thesis is just about belief in God or religious belief being rational without arguments. I will try and define epistemology in another slide, perhaps the next one, I can't remember, let's see. So the Reformed approach is to say this argument falls down not simply because we have good arguments, because even if we didn't have good arguments, that's not a problem. It rejects premise 1, namely the idea that belief in God is justified if and only if there are good arguments. So this is the approach that we're going to take now, or we're going to try and build that thesis. Andrew Moon, in his paper Recent Work in Reformed Epistemology, which I would recommend as a good introduction, although it's not the best. There are a couple others you could read before this one. I think it's, probably the third best intro for you to read. It does go into a bit of detail that you don't need in terms of a basic introduction, but Moon summarizes the thesis, as I've said. The thesis, Reformed epistemology, is the thesis or the idea that religious belief can be rational, and I put justified and warranted as well. These are concepts we're going to, touch on in the next slides without arguments. So that's a basic thesis, and this is what we're going to try to do, inshallah ta'ala. I just want to again double check everybody is with me. I'm seeing that some people are struggling to hear me. My microphone is not the best, but all I can say is do your very best to turn the sound up as much as possible, and inshallah things will be okay. All right, so gathering our conceptual toolkit. Now, I've said so far that we want to offer a model of Reformed epistemology. We want to show how it's possible that our belief in God, and by extension even our belief in Islam, which we'll get to, can be rational even if we don't have good arguments for it. But if we want to build a robust thesis, a robust model, we're going to have to gather our own little toolkit of concepts. We don't need rulers and pencils and spanners and screwdrivers, of course. We need concepts. We need ideas that are going to help us flesh out this thesis in an academic way, inshallah ta'ala. So this is what we're going to try and do first of all. We're going to try and gather our concepts, and we're going to take those concepts and apply those concepts to the model itself, inshallah. So epistemology, just to clarify, what do we mean by epistemology? So epistemology is a sub-branch or sub-discipline of philosophy. So philosophy, it's debatable what the definition of it is, but you might think of it as the discipline of using reason to essentially answer the fundamental questions of life, and that can be broken into different components. So you might have a philosophy that looks at religion, looks at specifically religious questions that we try to use reason to answer, and that's what we're doing here. We're thinking about the existence of God, for instance, whether he exists, whether we can be justified in believing in existence. We have other branches of philosophy like ethics, which looks at moral truths. Could there be such a thing as moral truths? That's a meta-ethical question, and if they are, how could we come to know these, for instance? And there are different theories about what constitutes the good, and so on. Now, epistemology is another branch. Epistemology is concerned specifically with knowledge, and so what are the conditions that a belief might need, such that we can say, oh, this belief is not just a mere belief, it's not just an opinion. This is knowledge, and it looks at concepts like justification, rationality. What does it mean for you to be justified in holding your belief, and how does that relate to knowledge? So that's broadly, very roughly, epistemology. And inshallah, any of you who want to read more, you can do. And there are plenty of basic introductions online. So now I'm trying to list some of the concepts that we're going to look at. These are concepts that we're going to try put in our toolkit and apply to our model. We're going to look at a very sort of rudimentary introductory account of knowledge, which is known sometimes as a tripartite definition, and because it includes three components, namely belief, truth, and justification. And we're going to look at whether that is a sufficient account for knowledge. Then we're going to look at another concept called warrant, which I'll just leave it as it is for now, and proper functionalism, which is an account of what warrant is, which will become clear soon, inshallah. And then we're going to look at the difference between basic beliefs and non-basic beliefs. Now, if you remember, the first slide, the very title of this webinar, uses properly basic Islamic belief. And so, inshallah, after we've got that concept, it's going to be clear what my title actually meant at the very beginning. So we have basic beliefs, non-basic beliefs, we have properly basic beliefs. That'll be clear, inshallah ta'ala. Okay. So let's look at this sort of rudimentary introductory account of knowledge as being JTB, justified true belief. So let's give you an example. Let's suppose you have a belief. You believe that all elephants are pink in color. This is a belief that you just find yourself having. It just comes to you spontaneously. Yeah, you believe it to be true. Now, could you know that, or would you know that's true? Would that belief be sufficient for knowledge? Well, obviously it wouldn't, and there's an obvious reason why, because it's missing a vital ingredient. And well, what's that ingredient? Obviously, that ingredient is truth. It misses the ingredient of truth. The reason why your belief that elephants are all pink in color couldn't constitute knowledge is because it simply isn't true. And knowledge necessarily assumes that we're talking here of something that's true. All right, so we know that having a mere belief is not sufficient for us to have knowledge. Well, what about a true belief? If I have a belief that's true, then surely I can know it. So let's suppose you have another belief. You believe I've used this example before. Let's suppose you believe that Accrington Stanley are going to beat Manchester United 5-0 in the third round of the FA Cup. For those of you who are not familiar with these things, this is football. I don't know if people are from different places, but yeah. So imagine you've got two teams playing football. I'm using Manchester United in this example because I don't support them. I support Liverpool, so I want them to lose in the example. Anyway, sorry for those who think otherwise. So there's a big gulf in class in the two teams, and so if you had the belief that Manchester United are going to lose at their home stadium 5-0, they're going to be knocked out of the competition, and you know that they have all of their star players, key players in Accrington who are already nowhere near the quality of Manchester United, also have key players missing from their side. But then, lo and behold, it turns out that Manchester United lose 5-0 at home, and you were right all along. So you had a belief, and that belief turned out to be true. But did you know that this was going to happen? Did you know that Manchester United were going to lose 5-0? Well, we'd be inclined to say, no, of course you didn't know. It was a mere guess. It was a case of epistemic luck. You had a lucky belief that turned out to be true. So a mere belief isn't sufficient for knowledge. True belief isn't even sufficient for knowledge. There seems to be something else that we're lacking here. It seems that we are lacking some reason or some connection or ground that supports our true belief. And this is known as justification. So let's suppose you have a third belief. You believe that it's raining outside. You look out of your window and you see the rain, steaming down against the rooftops across your street, and you hear the pitter-patter sound of the rain, splattering across, on your windows. And it actually is raining. It seems that you have a belief. That belief is true, and you have justification for that belief. It seems that you can hear the sound of rain, you can see the sound of rain, and maybe even if you have a window open, you can kind of smell the effects of rain on the grass or the soil or something like that. So it seems you have an account of knowledge here, doesn't it? It seems as though you know that that's true. You have a justified true belief, and therefore that's sufficient for knowledge. So just to sort of put this a little bit more clearly, I want to help you by clarifying what I mean by justification. So justification is roughly the idea, at least this is the way it's being used predominantly in 20th century and even 21st century epistemology, but certainly in the 20th century. It's the idea of, well, even in Western epistemology per se, but it's the idea of fulfilling your epistemic duties. It seems you have a sort of duty to try and access the evidence for yourself, to try and counter some objections to your belief, and to have some reason that you can reflectively access that supports the belief that you have. So that's what we mean roughly by justification. And so it seems, as I mentioned in our rain example, you have these sensory, perceptual beliefs that are access to you. You have this strong seeming, and so it seems that you have what we would call justification. Now, subhanAllah, it just reminded me that on the slide on Reformed Epistemology, I had a picture of like a head with a tree inside of it, and many of you are probably wondering why on earth I had that, why I had that picture, and I forgot to mention why that has any relation whatsoever to Reformed epistemology. Well, the idea is that, for instance, when you see a tree outside or in front of you, this sensuous imagery just impresses itself on your mind, almost as if you have this image strong seeming of the tree, the image in the mind that's been impressed upon you. And so you have this image, you have this reason that's accessible to you. Reformed epistemology can be seen as saying that, in different ways, that it's possible that the presence or the awareness of God can be sort of impressed upon the mind in a way that's similar. Of course, not in the sense of seeing imagery, but in the sense of being impressed upon the mind. So, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention that, but not to worry. So, this is what we mean by knowledge as being construed in terms of justified true belief. However, although it seems like a plausible account so far, it's not actually an account that anybody accepts anymore in epistemology and philosophy. There is a problem with this, and this is known as the Gettier Problem. There is a famous philosopher who is called Edmund Gettier, who wrote a famous paper, I think in 1963. It was only 3 pages long, but it sort of transformed the whole discipline of epistemology. And he showed conclusively, really, by way of, I think, 3 or 2 examples, that you can have justified true belief and yet you're lacking knowledge somehow. Okay, so how might that be? So we're questioning here whether the JTB account really sufficient for accounting for knowledge. And Edmund Gettier, as I mentioned, came to spoil the show for us. So you can see that clock on the picture there. And Bertrand Russell, of course, is before Gettier somewhat. But he offers a sort of pre-Gettier example. And so it's to do with a clock, but I've tried to paint a kind of a different picture using the same idea. So imagine one day you're going to the dentist, you have a dentist appointment, and normally you use your watch, but for some reason you don't have your watch. Suppose it's at the jeweler's, it's under repair, so you don't have access to it and you're not sure of the time now. So you rush quickly to the dentist, hoping that you've made your appointment on time, and let's say your appointment is at 3:15, and so you get into the waiting room of the dentist, and you look to the clock and you see it says it's 3 o'clock. So you sit down, you're relieved because you're on time and your appointment is going to be in 50 minutes. Now let's suppose that that's true and it really was 3 o'clock, and you had the belief that it's 3 o'clock, and you surely had justification for believing that it's 3 o'clock because you saw the clock and it says it's 3, so you had justification for that belief. But let's suppose that clock wasn't actually working, it wasn't ticking, and it just so happened that conveniently the clock was left in place at 3, but it wasn't ticking, it wasn't working, and let's say it hasn't been working for over a week. And so conveniently it was showing the right time at the time when you'd entered. So it seems here you had a belief, namely that it's 3 o'clock. That belief is true. It seems that you had some justification because you can see the clock saying that it's 3, but there seems to be an element of epistemic luck here, because it was just lucky that you saw the clock at the time you did. So it seems you can have justified true belief and not knowledge, because surely if you just came to this belief by way of luck, even though it's justified, you didn't really know that it's 3 o'clock. So this is a sort of simple example of a Gettier case. And so it just seems that you can have justification and truth, and you can have your belief, but you can still lack knowledge in some sense. So what are we to do with this? Is there a way out? Well, this is puzzling. Well, one of the ways out, and the way I'm going to be looking at, is by offering a different account of knowledge, which draws on a different concept. Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned justification is about accessing the reasons that support your belief, maybe defending that belief if counter objections come, and of fulfilling your epistemic duties in some sense. And so it's a lot to do with you accessing the beliefs reflectively. You know, they're impressed on your mind, you think about them or something like that. Now, warrant is the idea that, well, the warrant is defined simply as that quantity, enough of which turns a mere true belief into knowledge. So that's all it is simply. And warrant differs from justification, though, in important ways, at least in the way I'm going to try and demonstrate now. So, a famous philosopher of religion and philosopher in general, Alvin Plantinga, he spearheaded this thesis of Reformed epistemology, and he spearheaded the thesis of an idea of warrant, which is based primarily on the notion of our faculties functioning properly. So as I mentioned, warrant is the idea of that special ingredient that somehow turns a mere true belief into knowledge. Before we had a true belief that's justified, and yet it was lacking knowledge. It wasn't sufficient for knowledge. So we need something, that special source, that special ingredient that's going to give our belief knowledge. Now, we've seen that justification is, you know, roughly about you having access to certain reasons. But we've seen that in many cases, a few slides ago, where we had the belief in other persons, the belief in the external world, the belief in the past, it seems that we just don't have access to reasons or arguments that make our belief sufficient for knowledge. It seems that in the end, we simply have to rely on our intuitive products of our faculties. So when I look at the laptop, when my eyesight is functioning properly, it just seems to me very clear that I can see the laptop and I know the laptop is here. I don't have access to some arguments. There aren't really good arguments. It seems that something external to my access, just merely the functioning of my faculties, is what's really at the heart of giving me knowledge in all of these cases. Again, we believe in other persons because our faculties just produce this kind of belief, and we don't seem to have access to reasons necessarily, but the mere functioning of our faculties as they ought to do is sufficient for giving us knowledge. So here, warrant is shifting the focus away from factors that you're accessing inside your mind reflectively and focusing on something external to that, like just the faculties being reliable and functioning properly. And so this thesis of warrant being based on proper function has 4 conditions, and we're going to try and look at these conditions one by one, and then in the end we're going to suggest that this is the best way to construe the nature of a belief being sufficient for knowledge, and then we're going to see if our belief in God can meet these conditions. So the first point is the focus on proper functioning cognitive faculties. We have lots of different faculties. We have faculties of sight, faculties of hearing, we have faculties for reasoning, and they function in a certain way. They have what Plantinga calls a design plan, a way in which they ought to function. So, you know, like you have a heart, which is another faculty. A heart is supposed to beat, you know, a number of minutes on average. Your heart is supposed to beat a number of beats per minute on average. And when it, you know, beats in that way, it's functioning as it ought to do. Now, suppose it wasn't, you know, barely beating at all, or suppose there were too many beats per minute. There'd be something wrong with that faculty. It's not functioning as it ought to do. It's not functioning according to its design plan, the way in which it should. So that's the first point. Now, we can see how this is relevant to knowledge by way of an example. So suppose you have a man, he lives in the countryside, and he lives in a windy sort of area. And he has a wind chime hanging from his door outside. And so when the wind, when it's windy, the chime, sounds, and then he forms a belief that it's windy outside. And so, it seems that he's fulfilling his, he's justified. He has a belief that's accessible to him. In other words, he hears that sound, and on the basis of that, he infers the wind blows. But suppose when he got older, he suffered from some cognitive malfunctioning. Suppose that he couldn't hear anymore, so he's not able to hear the wind chimes anymore. But he also suffers from some kind of cognitive disease, which makes him occasionally have these auditory hallucinations where he hears this wind chiming sound. And let's suppose he hears this wind chiming sound on occasion when the wind is actually blowing and the wind chime is chiming. But of course, his belief is formed by way of sort of a hallucination. So it seems that he has a belief that he can reflectively access, he can be justified in a sense, but because his faculty is not functioning properly, he doesn't really know that the wind is blowing on the basis of the wind chimes chiming, because it's just an auditory hallucination because his faculties are not functioning properly. So it seems it's essential that we have proper functioning cognitive faculties, and that's the first condition. The second condition, I'll try to sort of speed things up, is that these faculties be aimed at truth. So if these faculties were not aimed at truth, then how would we be sure that the belief we have is really true and not just acquired for some other reason? And the other condition is that it occurs in an appropriate environment. I'm going to touch on that, and that it should be successful in some sense. The faculties aiming at truth. So that's the conditions roughly. Okay, so the proper function condition, as I've mentioned, this is the idea that we have cognitive faculties which function in a certain way. They have design plans, that is to say that they have a way that they ought to function. So yeah, consider the following just to sort of cement this within the mind. So suppose you look outside into your garden and you see what appears to you to be a rabbit. You see it, sort of hopping around among the grass, and then you have your friends come up to you and they tell you, oh no, it's not a rabbit, that's actually a squirrel. And then you realize, oh yeah, I wasn't wearing my glasses. And you put your glasses on, and then you see it was clearly a squirrel. Now the first belief you had, namely that there was a rabbit in the garden, it didn't have warrant for you. It wasn't sufficient for knowledge, because your eyesight wasn't functioning properly without the glasses. And so it's clear how proper function is necessary for you to reach knowledge. So that's the first point, that if your faculties are not functioning properly and you err in some sense, then of course your belief might just be a lucky one. It's not clearly one that would be warranted for you. And and that's the idea that warrant needs to be secured by proper functioning faculties. If there is some cognitive malfunctioning, obviously you don't know. Truth aimed condition. So the other condition is that your faculties they aim at truth in some sense. So you form a belief that the laptop is in front of you or something else. Now, if this if your faculties were aiming just for survival or for fulfilling wishes or something like that, then it seems you wouldn't be able to have warrant, because you couldn't be sure that your belief is true. There is something else going on here. Darwinian survival, for instance, Darwinian mechanism suggests that you form beliefs to help you survive and reproduce. Well, if that's the case, how can we be sure that even our belief in Darwinian evolution is not just a belief that helps us survive rather than being true? So truth aim is a necessary condition, and it seems in that sense it could be a problem for naturalism, at least on a Darwinian account. And also there is this idea that this needs to be occurring in an environment that is suitable for your faculties. So suppose, a little bit like in the picture, you enter a room and you look out of a window, let's say you think it's a window, and you see some scenery out there, and you think, oh, this is lovely, this is beautiful, but actually it was just a television screen that just was really realistic, and so your faculties were functioning fine, they're aimed at truth and so on, but you were tricked, your environment was tricked, it wasn't suitable for your faculties. And of course, our design plans must be successful, even if they aim at truth, but let's say that they get one true belief out of 100, so 99 wrong, one true, then you wouldn't have warrant, because most of the time, your beliefs are all false. So on the time you get it right, you have no reason to suspect that. So the idea then is a belief is sufficient for knowledge if it's produced by faculties that function properly and successfully aimed at truth in environments for which they're designed to apply. Finally, someone still might say, well, don't we need an access condition? That is, don't we need to access the reasons, for our belief to be warranted? But it just seems, as we said in the one of the earlier slides again, that our belief in other persons in the past, in the external world and so on, we just don't seem to have access to the reasons that confer warrant on those beliefs, but still we can have warrant. Yeah, I'm wary of the time of kind of like I'm going on a little bit, but I'll try to speed things up. So the final concept to grasp before we move on to our model is the notion of basic and non-basic beliefs. So consider a belief chain. We can have chains of beliefs. So suppose you have a belief that there is someone at your door because you heard the doorbell ring. So you have like two beliefs here. You have, number one, the belief that the doorbell rang, something that you hear comes to you immediately, and then two, you form the belief from that, you infer a second belief that there's someone at your door. Now, the first belief that comes to you immediately, without argument or inference, is something known as a basic belief. Sometimes it's seen as like a foundational belief. Like we have this as a foundation from which we form other beliefs. But the basic idea is, pardon the pun there, but the basic idea is that this belief comes to you immediately. It's not a belief you hold by way of argument. So again, I see the laptop in front of me. That's just a basic belief. It's something that comes to me immediately. I don't hold that belief on by way of argument. I don't argue from the proposition or premise, rather, that it appears to me there's a laptop in front of me, to the conclusion, therefore there's a laptop. No, again, with our belief in the past, with our belief in the external world and other minds. These are just basic beliefs. They just come to us intuitively, and we don't hold them by way of other beliefs. Non-basic beliefs are obviously beliefs we hold by way of inference, like our belief that there's someone at the door. This is something inferred from another belief. And then we have a notion of properly basic beliefs. So imagine, again, you have your basic belief. You see the rain outside. That's a basic belief. It just comes to you immediately. Now, if that belief is warranted for you, if that belief is produced by faculties that are functioning properly, aimed at truth and so on, then that's a properly basic belief. So it's a basic belief in nature that's also warranted for you. And so the central claim of Reformed epistemology is the idea that God can be a properly basic belief. We can come to belief in God in a basic way, and that belief can be warranted. Now, just as a final side point on this slide, it's clear that not just any old belief can be a basic belief. Like, let's suppose I just suddenly have the belief that next week on alternate days it will rain. Now, someone say, well, clearly you need an argument there. You need to infer that on the basis of some other beliefs, maybe on the basis of reading the weather forecast or something. It just seems that we can't hold that belief in a basic way. But when it comes to your belief in that it's raining outside, you see that it seems you can hold that in a basic way. So how can we differentiate between a belief that's like properly basic and a belief that's not? Obviously, a properly basic belief is one which is warranted, but also it seems that the difference between beliefs that are just basic and beliefs which are properly basic, it relates to the very nature of our belief forming faculties. We have faculties for forming beliefs about things in front of us. We have faculties for forming sounds that we hear nearby, or we have faculties of taste. We have faculties of reason and inference, but we don't have belief forming faculties that can just tell us that it's going to be raining on alternate days next week like that. We just don't have those faculties. So the idea might be to bear in mind that it seems we could argue maybe we have a faculty that for forming beliefs about God, and certainly studies in cognitive science of religion are suggestive of this in some sense. So we have our concepts, inshallah. I hope it's clear. Just to reiterate a few things, well, just to tell you that I have an essay coming out which is basically on this topic, and so inshallah that should be out very soon on the website, and obviously you'll be able to follow things through more clearly. So you'll have that reading, you can download it, print it, do what you want with it. And so this webinar is just an introduction for you to kind of get to grips with the basic idea and help you understand the essay, inshallah. So we've got our concepts. Now we want to outline our plan in applying this to belief in God more specifically, and then Islam as well, and constructing that model. So we're trying to build a model of Reformed epistemology which is designed to show how theism, namely the belief in God, and Islamic belief can be properly basic. It can be a belief that we hold, not on the basis of other beliefs, just intuitively, not on the basis of argument, and that belief can be warranted for us. Warranted along the lines of proper functionalism. The idea, as we said earlier, that it's produced by faculties that function properly, aimed at truth in environments suitable for it. And we want to show how this is in some sense consistent on an Islamic scheme. And so, as I mentioned, the central sort of, well, clearly the central figure, or the only figure that I'm proposing this model on, is Ibn Taymiyya, and the central notion in the model is the notion of fitrah. So that's going to be key to understanding how belief in God can be properly basic for us. So we have this standard Taymiyyan model, and I want to just quickly give you an overview, and then we're just trying to go through it point by point. So the idea is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has instilled within human beings different faculties in order to acquire true belief. So we have different faculties, sense perception, reason, sight, hearing, whatever. And these faculties have been placed within us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to form beliefs about things in the world, true beliefs. And Allah, He created them, meaning human beings, upon a natural constitution, which we're going to call the fitrah. And of course, Allah created us all upon the fitrah. And that fitrah urges us to know God. 3. The fitrah, this disposition, has been set to work in tandem with our other faculties. So when one's fitrah functions as it should, it can trigger within the heart, the qalb, also can be considered or translated as mind, immediate awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this typically arises, we could say, from the apprehension of the many ayat, or signs, in the created world. Therefore, through this role that the fitrah plays in giving us knowledge, and in conjunction with the heart, upon the apprehension of God's signs, belief in Him can be reached immediately without needing arguments. All right, so let's try and go through this a bit. Faculties for knowing. So it's clear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us these faculties for knowing Him, for worshipping him. As he mentions in the Quran, it is Allah, it is God who brought you out of your mother's wombs, knowing nothing, and gave you hearing, sight, and hearts, that you might be thankful. Now, as a side note, in Lane's lexicon, he explained that the term used here, afida, is plural of ad. Forgive me for that noise. And he explains that literally, fu'ad means heart, but also refers to mind or intellect. So that's something to bear in mind as well with what we're saying. And also, Ibn Taymiyya himself said, and I noticed that I forgot the page number for this. This is in here, the Majmu' al-Fatawa, in volume 9. I can get the page number for those interested. Yeah. So the heart was created to know things. Its pursuit of things out of a desire for knowledge is called thought and reflection, just as the ear's pursuit of speech, desiring to hear it, is called listening, and the eye's attention to things, trying to view them, is called sight. So it's clear that, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us with different faculties for true belief or knowledge. And Ibn Taymiyya, obviously on his scheme, and we're using his epistemic scheme, he, you know, he makes this clear that the heart is central in that sense. I've just noticed someone say, slow down, we're taking notes. Don't worry, inshallah, I can send these to people, the slides I mean, afterwards. And also, you're going to have my essay, which has got pretty much all of these quotes anyway. Okay, so we mentioned that the fitrah is central to the model. Okay, so we know the fitrah is mentioned in the Quran and Hadith. We know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that, you know, that He created us upon the fitrah. You know, fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nas alayha. It's the fitrah of Allah that He created mankind upon. And we know the Hadith, the famous Hadith, that every child is born on the fitrah. It's only the parents of the Christian, the Jew, the Zoroastrian that, you know, changes or tampers with that initial state. So we know that this is a clearly Islamic concept. Now, Ibn Taymiyya himself said that what the Prophet ﷺ meant in the Hadith is that there is a certain nature with which Allah created man, and that is the nature of Islam, by which he meant simply La ilaha illallah. And Allah endowed all human beings with this essential nature the day He addressed them, saying, "Am I not your Lord?" And they said, "Yes, we have testified in the Quran." You see that there in Surah 7, verse 1 and 2. And so, fitrah is the original nature of man, uncorrupted by later beliefs and practices, ready to accept the true notions of Islam. So let's get a little bit clearer on what fitrah might mean for Ibn Taymiyya, just so we can, you know, cement this notion that's central to the model within the mind. Ibn Taymiyya elsewhere said that it has been shown that in the human being's fitrah there exists a potency or an urge to believe in truth and intend the beneficial. The fitrah has a potency to know and believe in the Creator, and the fitrah also has a potency for His oneness, or tawheed. Now, what is becoming clear here is that the fitrah is not merely just a disposition of that, like human nature, you know, a sort of stagnant disposition that we're all created upon, but it's a normative disposition. It's something that pushes us towards believing certain things. It pushes us towards the belief in truth, and to intend what's beneficial, to believe in the Creator, and to believe that He is one, and to worship Him. And so that's central to the idea of fitrah in Ibn Taymiyya's scheme. Now, Ibn Taymiyya suggests here that the locus of the fitrah is the heart. He said that Allah made the fitrah of His servants disposed to the apprehension and understanding of the realities of things and to know them. And if it were not for this readiness, i.e. the fitrah within the hearts or minds to know the truth, neither speculative reasoning would be possible, nor demonstration, discourse, or language. So the fitrah is central to the whole cognitive scheme of the human being. So we mentioned the fitrah, its place is within the heart, as Ibn Taymiyya suggests there. So what's the sort of cognitive relationship between the heart and the fitrah? Again, I've got a picture here with the brain, but you can just think of that as a fitrah. All right, so here's the idea. Here's the scheme that we're going to. There are different ways you could put this sort of diagram, and I'm actually going to expand upon this in another essay that I'm writing in a journal, inshallah. But for now, we can think about it like this in terms of its relation to belief in God. So when the heart reaches a cognitive state that it believes in God, as long as the fitrah is functioning properly, it will result in a basic belief in God, that is, a belief immediately without arguments, and that belief will be properly basic as long as the fitrah is functioning properly and the heart is functioning properly. And so the acknowledgement of God's existence, Ibn Taymiyya said, and knowledge of him and loving him and unifying him are from the fitrah and firm in the qalb. So, this acknowledgement, this sense of God's existence, it's from the fitrah and it's firm in the heart when things are all functioning accordingly. So how might this occur? How might it be the case that we end up with belief in God in a basic way? Well, Ibn Taymiyya seems to suggest this in reference to the concept of ayat, and he has this notion of istidlal bil ayat, this idea of an inference through signs. Again, it's not an inference in the traditional sense, because the belief that's produced here is basic, but inference is really the only way of translating it. So Ibn Taymiyya said that proving or establishing God's existence by way of signs is something wajib, something obligatory, because this is the way of the Quran and inherent in the fitrah of the servants. So we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making mention of various ayat in the Quran that are signs for people who reflect, for people who remember, for people who reason, for people who believe or have faith. And this might occur, for instance, upon pondering the night sky or the glorious splendor of the cosmos and seeing design in nature, or in numerous different circumstances. As long as the fitrah is functioning as it ought to do, the apprehension of such signs can produce belief in God immediately. And Ibn Taymiyya, he makes a sort of, this is a classical distinction about ayatul anfus and ayatul afaq. So ayatul anfus, this is the idea of signs within yourselves. That's one set of circumstances. And ayatul afaq, signs in the horizon, in the cosmos, let's say. And so there are different sets of circumstances in which belief in God can be elicited in an immediate sense, as long as the fitrah is functioning as it ought to do. So the question we want to ask now is, can this Taymiyyan fitri scheme fit on that warrant account of proper functionalism that we talked about earlier? Well, it seems that it definitely can. First of all, Ibn Taymiyya has written that fitrah grounds knowledge of truth and his confirmation of it, and the rejection of falsehood and his rejection of it. So it's clear that the fitrah is essential in aiming all of our faculties at true belief. So it satisfies that truth aim condition, and we can see that from the Quran as well. But the fitrah is also essential to the proper function of other faculties, and I quoted actually Karl Sharif Atubgi, who's a friend of mine, who summarized this really well. when he said that the proper functioning of all our epistemic faculties is predicated in all cases on the health and proper functioning of the fitrah in Ibn Taymiyya's scheme. And so it seems that our faculties in question here, we talked of the heart as being sort of the general seat of all cognition and the fitrah being there. As long as these things are functioning properly as they ought to, and they're aimed at true belief, which we see the fitrah to be, and it's clearly aimed at recognition of God, as we've seen, it seems perfectly reasonable to think that this model can satisfy a proper functionalist counter warrant. And so it seems that theistic belief, I should say it's a properly basis, of course that's meant to be properly basic. It seems then that we can have belief in God in a basic way, and it can be warranted for us. Then we can think about this question of the burden of proof that we talked about in the second slide. If it appears to you that you have belief in God came to you in an immediate way, now if that's true, then it seems that the burden of proof would somewhat switch. Rather than you having to demonstrate your belief, you have a basic belief that can be warranted, and so the atheist has to show why it isn't warranted. Now we'll touch on this a little bit later, but we'll leave it there for now. And on to the next slide, de facto de jure, I'm going to just skip that. Okay, so we've seen how it could be possible for Islamic belief to be, for theistic belief to be warranted, to be sufficient for knowledge for us without having arguments. Again, of course, so far the model is on the supposition if it's true, like we're saying, if it's true that Allah exists and created us in such a way. We're not trying to prove that Allah exists, we're trying to show how it's possible we can have warrants, we can have beliefs that are sufficient for knowledge on an Islamic scheme. So just bear that in mind for the minute, and then I will touch on it shortly, and that's relevant to what I was saying about the burden of proof. Now, we've seen again, as I said, how this can be related to theism, but is there a way we can extend it more specifically for our belief in Islam? Now, Ibn Taymiyya elsewhere has spoken of two broad categories of signs. So we have the signs which indicate the existence of the Lord, may he be exalted, are one, his spoken signs that he mentions in the Quran, and two, signs of his creative acting which he created in the souls and the cosmos. Now, if it's possible that, when the fitrah functions properly and it's aimed at truth, as we've said, when we reflect on signs in the cosmos, it's possible that we can, come to immediate basic belief in God's existence and presence. Well, it's also possible that when we read the ayat, the verses in the Quran, the spoken words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can reach basic belief. It can just come to us immediately. We can be filled with the immediate sense and obviousness of Allah's words being true and that this being from Allah, and therefore we can culminate now our full model with Islam. So as long as the faculties of fitrah in conjunction with the heart are functioning properly, they're aimed at truth, then when we read the Quran, it's possible that we have basic belief in God, and that belief in conjunction with the proper function account of warrant can be warranted, and therefore it can be sufficient for knowledge, and therefore we can know the truth of Islam in a basic way without arguments. So I just want to give you a complete overview of this extended element of the model, and then I'll just touch on something that I've mentioned I will touch on about the assumptions here. So from points 1 to 5 of the standard model, we have 6. So just as Allah has made available an immediate apprehension of his existence through his many signs in the created world, so too has he permitted more intimate knowledge of him through the signs in his revelation. 7. Upon apprehension of these revelatory signs that are read and understood, this is something that Ibn Taymiyya's student Ibn Qayyim refers to. I don't have this quote here, but it's in my essay. So upon apprehension of these revelatory signs that in the Quran that are read and understood, human beings can acquire basic beliefs in the truth of God's revelation and hence the truth of his religion. This immediate belief of the truth or in the truth of Islam arises through the natural workings of the fitrah in conjunction with the heart upon apprehension of these signs, that is, the verses of the Quran. Therefore, full-fledged Islamic belief can be acquired in immediate and basic fashion without recourse to arguments. Okay, so that's the model. And we try to apply our epistemic concepts to it. Now, we're going to discuss a few problems with the model people might have before I conclude. But the first thing to say is this: well, you've been saying, or some might say, you've been saying that, you know, Allah created us and so on. So you've been assuming the truth of Islam all the way through. And I say, yeah. So we're saying if it's true. But why should I suspect that it's true? Someone might say, why should I suspect that my belief is true? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it seems that what we do in many cases, if not most, our belief in the laptop being in front of me, our belief in the past, our belief in the external world, our belief in other persons, it seems that reasons are not necessarily accessible to us, but we rely on and trust the output of our cognitive faculties. We rely on the output of our cognitive faculties, and we say as long as they're properly functioning, aimed at truth and so on, then our beliefs have warrant, and I am justified in holding that they are aimed at truth and functioning properly because it seems to me that way. I have no reason to suspect that they're not. And so in the absence of any defeater for your belief, you seem to be entirely justified in suspecting your beliefs are warranted and that they're being produced in the way that they need for warrant. And so you have these beliefs about, you know, things in front of you and so on, and you're relying on your cognitive faculties, you're trusting them in these cases in the absence of any reason to suspect there's something going wrong. So that can be naturally extended now to our belief in Islam. Again, just as my other beliefs about things I see before me and about other persons in the external world and so on, as long as there's no reason to suspect, you know, I have a defeater for my belief, it just seems obvious to me, it seems as clear as anything else, then I have justification for suspecting my belief is warranted, and therefore I think that it probably is, and I'm justified in thinking that, and so therefore I'd say my belief is warranted and that I can know and I do know. So that's the way it seems to be in the absence of some defeater. We are entirely justified in suspecting our belief is fully warranted in the same way as our other beliefs that we've mentioned. But we might suspect that people have some problems with this, and we'll try and entertain some of them. So forgive me for the silly image. But one thing that people have brought up is, well, surely if you say, you know, belief in God and Islam can be properly basic, we might as well claim that the great pumpkin that comes back every Halloween is properly basic. You know, anyone can say that. Well, how would we respond to this? Well, first of all, obviously, because a belief is properly basic, that doesn't mean that just any old belief can be properly basic. Suppose you have the belief that 1 + 1 is 2, and you just have that belief in the immediate sense. Well, and we know pretty clearly that that belief is warranted, that that belief is something we know. Why would it follow that because 1 + 1 is 2 is a properly basic belief, just anything can be a properly basic belief? Well, obviously not just anything can be a properly basic belief. Only the beliefs held in a basic way by our faculties properly functioning and so on, as they ought to do, can be a properly basic belief. But perhaps that's not what someone means by the great pumpkin objection. Perhaps they mean, well, why couldn't it be that a great pumpkin could be sufficient for warrant? Couldn't it be that we have this great pumpkinatus, this great sense of a pumpkin, as opposed to sensus divinitatis, a sense of God. The great pumpkin has, you know, created us with. Well, what would we say about that? Well, first of all, unlike our theistic belief, the great pumpkin suffers from an obvious empirical objection because it's something that's physical and so on, and so if it doesn't have empirical evidence for it, then that would give us reason to suspect that it doesn't exist. And but belief in God, of course, is quite different, because belief in God is not something empirically observable. It can't be disproved in that sense. But moreover, why think that there'd be a great pumpkin that obviously wants to create things and give them true beliefs and obviously cares about them in some way? It just seems that the way you're glossing this up is you're just picking another term for God. You're actually thinking about a theistic picture, but you're glossing it up in other terms. So I think that's the way one might respond to it, and there are a number of other cases as well, but I think it suffers from an obvious empirical defeater, and it just seems as another way of glossing the theistic picture, and not just any old belief can be properly basic, because some are. Well, what about religious diversity? Couldn't a Christian or a Jew, for instance, construct a model similar to ours on the basis of their beliefs? What do we have to say about this? Well, first of all, this idea of a problem of religious diversity is predicated on what I've written here, EWP. RE means Reformed Epistemology. EWP is the equal weight principle. So it's sort of suggesting, like, in the presence of other people who claim they have a model similar to yours, we should sort of, we have a defeater for ours because we suspect that they are equally justified in holding their own model. But there seems to be a problem with this equal weight principle, because the equal weight principle is saying that our epistemic peers who disagree with us, we should give equal weight to what they say just as much as what we say, given the similar circumstances. But then someone who disagrees with the equal weight principle and thinks that it's not true, then we should give equal weight to that notion as well. And so it seems that we are self-defeated. It seems, you know, we've like shot ourselves in the foot with that principle. So that's one thing. We might think that obviously our epistemic peers in Jews and Christians, they're not our actual peers in this sense, because you know, as the hadith on Fitra says, it's their parents that raised them in environments and circumstances where they're not accessing the sorts of evidences we have for our beliefs about Islam. They don't have access to that somehow. They've been deterred from access to that. So we might think that we are not epistemic peers, and an equal weight principle is problematic, so we might dismiss it. That's one thing we might mention. But there are other problems then with this, and some people might suggest other solutions. Now, I'm just going to tie things up here. I've been going on longer than I wanted to, so please forgive me. Well, a classical response from the Reformed epistemologists to this is to say that, you know, in the case where you have arguments against your belief, it's not necessarily such that we should give it up unless we have another argument. So suppose you've been accused, or suppose somebody's been accused of stealing something, and suppose that person you know, is known for stealing something. Let's say they're known for stealing watches or something like that. And then suppose one day, you know, a watch went missing, and it ended up being the case that a man seen by CCTV looked just like that person, and somehow some of his items, like his car keys, were next to the table where the watch was taken from, and a number of evidence stacks up against him. And so the judge in court and the jury, they've got good reason to suspect, a good argument, a probabilistic argument, an evidential argument to suspect you're guilty, but not you, the person in question, sorry. But suppose that that person has a very clear and strong memory belief and knows that they were not there on that day, but they don't know of any other good reason or argument. They just have that strong basic belief, which is clear to them and it's true. It seems that they would still be justified and warranted in holding on to their own basic belief, even in the face of these reasons or arguments against their belief, even if they don't have any argument to rebut it, other than this just intuitive belief they hold. So that's one way to go. If our beliefs are the products of our faculties, which are hardwired to produce certain types of beliefs, maybe it's just that Islamic belief is a belief that's, hardwired. We are meant to produce this belief, and so even in the face of arguments, we don't need to respond by arguments. And I'll just give one more solution, which says, well, actually, no, you can use arguments. It would say that it makes a kind of distinction between sort of a first and second order level of things, cognitively speaking. So imagine, you can think about this in terms of a lift. Like imagine on the ground floor, you obtain a basic belief in God's existence, just comes to you immediately. But then on the first floor, at the first order level, you get a defeater for your belief, let's say by the problem of religious diversity or something, or problem of evil or something else. And then on the second floor, you respond to that defeater. You offer a defeater by giving some reason to suspect that that defeater is not true. Then all of a sudden you're warranted in holding that belief that you have at the very first order level on the ground floor in a basic way. And so you don't need positive arguments for your basic belief, but you might need some arguments to deal with defeaters. So something like that. This is known as bi-evidentialism sometimes by Michael Sudduth. Anyway, so this is the basic idea, inshallah. I'm going to put my essay out hopefully within a few days for you guys to read it. And I'm going to now try to take a few questions, but I am wary that I've been going on for quite some time. But yeah, let's see, inshallah, what you guys think. Just as a summary, we talked about warrant as being proper functionalism, that belief is warranted if and only if it's produced by faculties functioning properly, aimed at truth, etc. And then we have this idea of properly basic beliefs. We have some basic beliefs. I can see the laptop in front of me. Properly basic, meaning it's warranted for me because it's produced by proper functioning faculties, etc. And then we try to apply that to a Taymiyyan standard model, showing how belief in God could be warranted in a similar way, how belief in Islam could be warranted in a similar way, and we try to address a couple of concerns. So, inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to try to take a few questions now. I'm kind of confused, subhanAllah, on how to use this whole question bar. So please bear with me, because I don't know how I can make the box bigger. It's really, really small, and it makes it really, really difficult. This is a problem. Let's see. Okay, wait, I think, okay, here we go. Okay, so I'll try and take a few. Obviously, I can't take them all. So someone said here, Alex Parker asks, this is a bit long, so I apologize. I have a potential rebuttal of the atheism as default notion, and I'm interested in your thoughts. My position is that atheists only apply such an epistemological position because it seems to be the most logically sound one. However, that isn't true, because atheism requires one to give moral value to truth, which an atheist worldview cannot substantiate. Hence, there is a contradiction, and atheism isn't logically sound as an intellectual position. However, that isn't true, because everything requires to give moral value. Well, I think perhaps you're right. I'm not sure, but I think there is another way to put it, which is to say that there just doesn't seem to be a naturalistic slash atheistic account of the conditions of proper functionalism. So you know how a belief to be warranted needs to be produced by faculties aimed at truth. I just don't see how a naturalist account can guarantee us that our beliefs are aimed at truth, whereas theism can. And if it cannot account for that, then it would mean that on atheism, on naturalism, all our beliefs would not be warranted. But clearly our beliefs are warranted, and so therefore atheism or naturalism is false and theism is true. Okay, another question by Amr. Assalamu alaikum, how do you even know you have a true belief then, even without justification? So the idea here is that you would know that your belief is true in the sense that, well, you have justification for believing that it is knowledge. This goes into a wider discussion about externalism and internalism in epistemology, but what I'm saying is that my belief in the laptop in front of me, well, that's a belief I'm justified in holding. Like, I know it's true in the sense that there is no reason I have to suspect that it's not. And, you know, it's clearly warranted if it's produced in the way that we see that it is seemingly produced, and we have clearly no reason to suspect otherwise, and so we can know. Musa'ab Munir, how do we distinguish observations from knowledge? What is an observation? Just something true because you observe it. In your article, you say when the fitrah is triggered, such knowledge will go to the qalb and make it true. But how is the fitrah triggered? From my reading, is that our feelings in outer ones give us data, and then our brain takes them and makes them abstract ideas, etc. Well, as I mentioned, that it seems to be triggered on the apprehension of ayat. So that's the way I would construe that. Okay. Isn't belief in God an inference belief from a basic belief in material world? It could be. You know, you can have arguments for existence of God. Ibn Taymiyya has suggested that people might need arguments whose fitrah is corrupt, for instance, and can't access the knowledge of God in a basic way. But in our case, it's just on reflection, or in the circumstances that we're in, we're having this belief in God in an immediate way. But you can definitely argue from fine-tuning, let's say, in the material world, or from the beginning of the universe, to a creator, designer that we would call God. So this is all for stating that my belief in one God is rational without empirical evidence, because if an atheist says to me that he doesn't believe in God or this concept, then I can't prove it to him, but I can claim my belief is rational. Yeah, I mean, the idea that I'm presenting here is that, first of all, you can be rational, you can be justified in believing in God without argument. And secondly, you can even know that without argument. And in just the same ways which you think about your own beliefs about perception, about the past and other persons. Of course, the atheist isn't going to accept this, but that's fine. That's his, you know, that's his opinion. But we've shown how belief in God can be warranted. Now, that belief for me is justified in the absence of some defeater. So here we shifted the burden of proof, because if I'm justified in holding this belief, then the atheist needs to show me that my belief is false in some sense, because you know, the atheist accepts I can believe in the laptop in front of me without arguments, and I'm justified. There's no reason to suspect I'm not. It can be warranted. Same thing with God. So yeah. And so yeah, istidlal bil ayat is an inference through science to awaken the fitrah. Does that make it a non-basic belief? No, it doesn't, because the immediate belief you have is triggered by, yes, of course, using your reason in the sense of reflection, but that's not based on other beliefs. That's just on pure reflection and so on. So there are a lot of questions here that are a bit long. I really am very, very sorry, wallahi, to not answering them all. I think I might have to defer you to emailing me these things. So I'll just say for now, if anybody wants to email me, they can at jamie.turner at ibn haldun dot edu.tr. And anyway, I'll put things on my essay if you know some content. Okay, I'll try and answer a couple more though. Salam, is this just for the existence of Allah or the whole of Islam? How do we know that our beliefs are not due to psychological reasons like our family's comfort? I think this is a really good question. All of the questions are really good though, mashallah. But this is a good question because it reminds me of something I wanted to say. Yeah, so of course I've tried to show it for the whole of Islam. Now, how does one not know that our beliefs are not just the result of some psychological process? Well, that's the thing. It seems that the only way one could argue that it's just the result of psychological reasons is if they know God doesn't exist. It means they have to assume that God doesn't exist, because if God exists, then he created our faculties such that even in, you know, scenarios where maybe we feel worried, we feel stressed, or, you know, etc., etc., even in those cases, if Allah exists, then Allah could make those circumstances reasons and means for us to come back to belief in him. So the only way to pursue this line of argument is to assume God doesn't exist. And so the atheist has to give us some reason. So that's the thing. So that's a good point. I'm sorry if the presentation was somewhat complex. I think my essay will clear things up, inshallah, and forgive me for the volume if it wasn't very good. So yeah, inshallah, that'll do for now. It went on a lot longer than I even intended, and also I will allow you guys to email me, and then inshallah I'll respond to your questions one by one. So I hope you benefited from it, and I hope you're going to benefit from the remaining sessions. Jazakumullah khair again. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and I look forward to some fruitful discussions with you via email. Just to answer one last question, how do you prove something is properly basic? And just to reiterate, you know, we're saying that something is properly basic if it is produced by faculties functioning properly and so on aimed at truth, and we come to that belief aimed in a basic way. And as long as we have no reason to suspect that it isn't like that, we are entirely justified. And so our belief in seeing the laptop and so on, or whatever it might be, is a properly basic belief for us. So my essay will be on the website within a few days, I hope, inshallah. So that's it for now, and take care everyone, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.